Hey guys, so welcome back. Um, it's late, so I'm not going to be super loud while reading this one. Now, for those who have not watched this before, we are reading a book called "The Sickness Is a System: How Capitalism Fails to Protect Us from Pandemics or Itself" by Richard Wolff. I hope you guys will, if you guys haven't watched it, go back and watch the first chapter and then come back. Um, so yeah, let's go ahead and get started for chapter two. So, chapter two: Capitalism versus COVID-19. Failures to prepare, contain, or both. How U.S. politics sustains U.S. capitalism. Under their contradictions, explode coexisting economic and political systems sustain one another. Quote, normal politics includes precisely the process of working out social conflicts just as the economic system is sustained. Whatever its form, the state's task includes the sustenance. When politics and the state can no longer perform adequately, the system totters. Only then can movements for system change seriously contest the existing system and press for transition to another? Capitalism displays this pattern in general, and particularly in the United States. To see this, we divide the US population into three groups. The first comprises the 1% richest, mostly corporate directors, etc. The second is the 9% below them, who are mostly professional assistants and servants to the 1%. Below them, the third group includes the 90% of the population split between the poorest 45% and the remaining 45%, henceforth the quote middle. The top 10% are the dominant funders, leaders, etc., of both major parties, Republican and Democrat. Separately and in comfortable oscillation, both parties sustain U.S. capitalism. The D's loudly sympathize with and appeal to the bottom 45%. Those millions get paid poorly, have few benefits, and suffer job insecurity. Because they have relatively little to lose, they represent a constant potential threat to capitalism. To counter that threat, the D's support policies to soften the system's hard edges: minimum wages, progressive tax structures, welfare supports, etc. Lefties want the top 10% to pay for those policies. Moderate or centrist D's disagree. They fear that such an approach risks driving otherwise sympathetic members of the top 10% to redirect financial, media, and other resources from D to R. With few temporary exceptions, moderate Ds have prevailed. Thus, when D's policies govern, their tax costs fall heavily on with maximum effect on the middle. The R's work differently. They stress that D policies are chiefly driven by concern for the bottom 45%. They underscore the unfairness of the hard workers in the middle to fund the bottom 45%, the quote takers. R's often characterize those takers, often in radicalized terms, as unwilling to work hard or at all, dependent on the nanny state, etc. R's describe the political goal as ending the special benefits for the bottom 45%, quote, except for the truly needy, and thereby saving taxpayers in the middle. The R's rhetoric keeps the top 10% happy because it proceeds as if the political struggle over taxes is only between the two halves of the bottom 90%. When the lefties discuss raising taxes on the top 10%, R's dismiss such talks as class war and utterly unrealistic. While both parties readily describe themselves as capitalist or pro-capitalist, it is especially their oscillation in office that sustains capitalism. The policies of one party proceed so that until they so aggravate the country that demands for change arise. That demand is met by moving to the other party and its policies. System criticism and system change stay out of politics. Ours insist that deregulating and subsidizing, job creating, capitalists will trickle down to benefit all. The D's propose helping especially the bottom 45%, because trickle down happens too little and too late. When D's win, resentment builds and opens the way for R's to oust D's and proceed to cut sole services for the bottom 45%. Trump is well within this oscillating tradition, although he won by positioning himself outside and against the mainstream D's and R's. That tapped the mass rage built up against both as responsible for the ever greater distance between the top 10% and all the rest. Today, establishmentees again urge the bottom 45% to reject the extremity of Trump's administration. That plus the usual salacious revelations, corruptions, etc. may win over moderate R's alienated by the Trump spectacle. If another oscillation in power is the D's in 2018 and or 2020, U.S. politics will again sustain the capitalist system. D's would likely repress both independent movements for system change, as Obama crushed Occupy Wall Street in 2011, and moderately parallel movements inside their party. Of course, contradictions beset all relationships, including that linking U.S. politics and U.S. capitalism. Politics always undermines, as well as sustains capitalism, which effect prevails depends on how the myriad of social influences shapes the relationship. For example, the state has always undermined capitalism by the potential threat it presents. Given universal suffrage, the state's dependence on majority voting always risks producing state policies that hurt capitalism or even ended by moving instead to, say, socialism or feudalism, etc. That is why laissez-faire and libertarian ideas have always been fostered by capitalism. They work to keep the state weak, hobbled, demonized, etc. On the other hand, capitalists look to the state for a vast array of supports: laws against labor unions, bailouts in crisis, industrial subsidies, global military operations, supportive school curricula, etc. Tensions beset capitalism, as some strengthen the state to get more supporters for capitalism while others weaken it for fear of what a strong state might do. Thus, the anti-tax party of Trump, GOP imposes tariffs, attacks, launches trade wars, etc., while also encumbering the state with rising budget deficits, strengthening and weakening the state simultaneously. For a transition to socialism to get underway requires a different politics, a new and genuinely different political party. For example, it could offer clear and explicit opposition to capitalism's continuance. It could advocate a systematic chain alternative, say democratic worker co-ops, instead of the hierarchical employer-employee capitalism. Politics in the U.S. would then finally emerge from the narrow two parties agreed on sustaining capitalism, only fight over how to best do that. There would finally be a real opposition, a real political debate about which alternative system best serves the people's needs. The development and growth of such a party would change U.S. politics and its relationships to U.S. capitalism. R's and D's do all they can, separately and together, to prevent such a party from emerging. No surprise there. The question is why the many who grasp the need to get beyond capitalism yet still hesitate about such a party. Part 2. Neither Democrats nor Republicans will admit that problem is capitalism itself. Leaders around the world increasingly worry about the next capitalist recession, or economic downturn, now looming globally. In Europe's strongest economy, Germany, a recession has already arrived, and all but formal naming U.S. manufacturing has declined for the last 2 quarters. Negative interest rates, where lenders pay borrowers to make a loan, are an increasingly widespread sign. Another sign is that lenders charge higher interest rates for short-term versus long-term loans because they fear an impending recession will make borrowers' ability to repay riskier in the short term. Anxieties about safety reflect the sense of impending economic crash. Trump is perhaps the most worried among world leaders fearing recession. Having made the economy a central issue for his re-election effort, he needs the U.S. economy to be in great shape. He repeats the few statistics available to support such claims. Yet Trump's fears of a looming recession and its possible consequences for his 2020 re-election are also evident. He recently branded the man he made chair of the U.S. Central Bank, Jerome Powell, an enemy, like the leader of China. Powell's refusal to cut interest rates drastically, a classic tool to slow or postpone a recession, was Trump's target. Trump recognizes, as other leaders do, that their political futures hinge on the next recession. And when it hits, how bad it gets and how long it lasts. Recessions have always haunted leaders of countries where capitalism is the prevailing system. The basic cause of current and past downturns in capitalist economies is the system itself. It has been plagued by and subjected its people to the plague of cyclically recurring economic downturns for the last 250 years. They happen on average every 4 to 7 years. Although particular conditions of time and place can occasionally make the period longer or shorter, they happen wherever in the world the capitalist system came to prevail. As that prevalence became global, so too have the cyclical downturns. Profit-driven market capitalism has mechanisms and incentives that generate growth but also repeatedly produce imbalances in the supplies and demands for inputs and outputs. Those imbalances cause price movements that eventually and adversely affect profits. Capitalists then cut back their investments, resulting in the unemployment and reduced production that comprise and define recessions and downturns. The downturns offset the initial imbalances, enabling capitalism's cycle to repeat. The recessions are thus not instances of market failures, nor instances when markets function imperfectly because of government interventions. Rather, recessions and downturns are how market capitalism corrects the imbalances it also causes. In other words, market capitalism has mechanisms of self-healing alongside the mechanisms that make it sick. Those who live in capitalist systems repeatedly suffer through both mechanisms so long as that system prevails. Capitalism's downturns hurt political leaders, careers because of their effects on the well-being of the mass of people. Widespread losses of jobs and businesses mean many mortgages go unpaid and homes get foreclosed. Parents cannot pay for children to finish higher education. People forego needed medical care, leading to later, more costly treatment. Stress from lost jobs and incomes strain family relations, often to breaking points. As all levels of government suffer, reduced tax revenues, budget deficits, and public debt rise and public services decline just when they are needed, more than ever because of the economic downturn. Popular dissatisfaction at downturns and all their effects usually spills over to dissatisfaction with politicians and parties in power when they occur. Capitalist downturns also provoke thoughtful victims and observers to ask two questions. Why does it happen, and what might be done to stop it from happening? Will those questions extend to asking why this system produces such downturns, or so recurrently throughout its history everywhere? Will the process of answering including a discussion of the systemic nature and causes of downturns? Will capitalism itself then become a target for criticism? Might that lead to the really big question lurking in such criticism? Can we do better than capitalism with a system that does not have nor need recurring downturns? Most political leaders of countries where capitalism is the prevailing system know, consciously or not, that their job descriptions includes a commandment, thou shalt not, or even question capitalism as a system. Instinctively, self-preservation drives them to find and focus public attention elsewhere. Plausible other, non-systemic causes need to be defined and announced. If needed, suitable scapegoats, notably those that have proved useful in the past, need to be blamed. Thus, Trump focuses attacks on the Federal Reserve as a short-run scapegoat. Its failure to drop interest rates as far and as fast as Trump wants will cause recession. Likewise, he attacks Democrats and mass media for exaggerating recession risk, purposely to bring a recession that will undermine Trump's re-election. Similarly, Boris Johnson in the UK blames the recession looming there on the European Union, or EU, on a delayed Brexit from the EU, on immigrants, and the other usual targets, and scapegoats for his Conservative Party. Likewise, many other European leaders follow suit, blaming existing or looming recessions on immigration, on US-China economic warfare, on Brexit, and so on. Much the same leadership patterns appear elsewhere. It is important to notice how leaders carefully, consistently, avoid any critique of the capitalist system and its internal structure for generating yet another economic downturn, and its long, long history of doing that repeatedly. That absence speaks very loud once you note it. The lack of a systemic critique soon becomes routinized. The public is, in effect, trained to see only the external, conjunctural conditions of and influences of economic downturns. That taboo applied generally to systemic critique in capitalism, then covers a public discussion of capitalism's regular, socially disruptive, and immensely caustic systemic instability. Instead, a systemic critique, we often get overheated debates over alternative policies to limit, contain, and moderate recessions. Conservatives generally have wanted to limit government, counter-cyclical intervention, and the economy. They favor minimalism and monetary actions, as in changing interest rates, quantity of money in circulation. Liberals and social democrats favor larger government interventions where they focus more on fiscal policy, as changing taxes, government spending. Thus today, Trump hammers the Fed to get low interest rates but waffles on a large infrastructure spending program that Democrats prefer, for example. Far less important than the details of these debates is their shared function. Both sides keep the public from discussing the systemic causes of recurring downturns. Both sides avoid any discussion of systemic change as a logical part of a rational response to the latest or impending downturn. However, nuanced or mathematicized the professional economics literature on counter-cyclical policies, like the political discourses, it too keeps system change off the agenda for discussion, let alone policy analysis or prescriptions. Rarely, a few debaters defensively acknowledge that systemic causes and changes might belong logically in the discussion of capitalist downturns. But doing so, they assure their audiences would be simply unrealistic. That is because monetary and fiscal policies fall within what politicians can do, while system change does not. In short, realism is their defense for the limitations they place on their studies of and responses to the capitalist downturns. But that defense fails. Why and how is it realistic to limit public and professional debate and discussion to policies that never end up or stop the problem they purport to address? In the US, every president since at least Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised the American people that he would not only end the capitalist downturn his administration faced, but also that his policies would make sure such downturns would not afflict succeeding generations. No president could or did keep that promise. Current Democratic candidates for president, including Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders on the left, have not yet gone beyond the combination of fiscal and monetary anti-recessionary policies captured under the phrase New Deal, while proposals for a Green New Deal address environmental as well as anti-recessionary needs. They once again hesitate to go beyond them to propose basic systemic change. Genuine realism would admit those policies, failures, and open the public and professional discussion of capitalism's recurring recessions to systemic critiques and solutions involving systemic change. Capitalism's political servants, Trump and Johnson. For the last half-century, US and UK capitalisms led the way in undoing the parallel legacies of the New Deal and Europe's social democracies. For its ascending Thatcher-Reagan couple to descending Trump-Johnson imitation, neoliberal capitalism replaced Keynesian capitalism. Private corporate capitalists funded effective campaigns to celebrate neoliberalism. The US and UK institutionalized it by deregulating and privatizing further and faster than anywhere else. Over the same period, private capitalists attacked the working class on three fronts. Neoliberalism proved ideological cover in the attacks. Its ideologues insisted that their goals, deregulation and privatization, would bring prosperity and growth to all, a win-win program for everyone. Neoliberalism sought out many Keynesians and social democrats. They had wavered especially after the 1960s when they could no longer preserve, let alone advance, working class gains, won in the post-1929 Depression. Resigned to neoliberalism, many leaders of center-left, labor and socialist parties redefined themselves as merely advocates for its less harsh forms. The first front in capitalism's attack was outsourcing production and jobs. At first, manufacturing moved from capitalism's older centers, Western Europe, US, Japan, to China, India, and other low-wage areas. Large profits gained by early outsourcers forced many to competitive outsourcing later. Many service industries followed neoliberals hailed globalization. To them, it showed efficiency and prosperity delivered by deregulation and privatization. Less movable employers. construction, retail, trade, fast food, etc. Raised profits by opening a second front against the working class. They chose increasingly to hire low-wage immigrants desperate to escape from economic, political, and military crisis in their home countries. The undocumented were especially attractive. They lacked legal resources for unpaid wages, illegal job conditions, etc. Their labor was unprotected. The third front in the employer's attack was more important than outsourcing or immigration. And a new automation wave, computers, robots, artificial intelligence boosted profits by displacing workers. Automation enabled workers and number of employers to cut wage bills relative to revenues from sales. Ideologues then attributed rising profits to neoliberal capitalism's win-win globalization. Neoliberal ideology did not last long. Widening gaps between winners and losers from globalization strengthened ideological critiques of win-win claims. Corporations, stock markets, venture capitalists, and the few they enriched, capital gains, dividends, merger fees, etc., were clear winners. Top executives scored huge pay packages. Top professional advisors enjoyed big salaries and bonuses. Losers, on the other hand, were almost everyone else. A vast majority, workers, suffered stagnant wages and deteriorating jobs. Large industrial cities, Cleveland, Detroit, etc., atrophied alongside small Rust Belt cities and much of rural America. Average real wages stagnated since the 1970s. Chasing the American dream drove millions to concur. Mounting personal debts, mortgage, auto loans, credit cards, and the student loans. That added credit anxieties to their accumulating anguish over flat real wages, eroding benefits, and ever less job security. Capitalism's three-pronged attack hurt. Exporting jobs, importing low-wage work, immigrants, and automation combined to generate that great for capitalism mix of rising productivity and stagnant wages. Starting in the 1980s, profits soared and lifted stock markets. Those profits provided much of the money they loaned to working-class borrowing to offset stagnant wages. Rising personal debts proved a fragile economic foundation. They helped obscure the fastest-growing rich-poor gap. The 2008 crash, rendered painfully visible, would have been obscured. It broke the promise from politicians, academics, and the media that lessons and learned, and reforms instead guaranteed that 1929-type crashes would never recur. The 2008 crash also exposed harsh social realities. The US and UK had become sharply more unequal economically and politically. Both governments quickly endorsed very expensive bailouts for the same banks that helped cause the crash. Both governments paid for bailouts with decreasingly progressive tax revenues and still more borrowing. And both then pointed to rising government debt to justify austerity for everyone else. The only difference, Labor and Democrats advocated a less harsher austerity than conservatives and the Republicans. Once again, exposed as performing so much better for the employer class than for the employee class. Capitalism runs big risks. Systemic questions and criticisms arise, challenge the status quo, and strengthen social movements for systemic change. That happened during past capitalist crashes, and certainly after 1929. Capitalism needs system-preserving political and ideological programs to get through crashes even more than it needs them between crashes. Since 2008, nationalism once again played a key role in capitalism's self-preservation, and had done so earlier, and for example, Mussolini's and Hitler's promises to make Italy and Germany great again against enemies, mostly foreign but also domestic, those not genuinely Italian or Aryan. Nationalists, in the sense of anti-foreign, ideology covered the state-managed fascist. Reinforcement or reconstruction of the employer-employee relationship that defines capitalism and that had been sharply challenged in and by the 1930s Depression. Trump's Make America Great Again plays to many Americans' sense of loss before and after 2008. He attacks immigrants and cheating foreign partners as if they caused Americans felt losses. In the UK, Johnson's Brexit program exorciates Europeans as if they caused the UK's deep economic and political inequalities. bashing and limiting foreigners, including immigrants, are main themes of capitalism's current political servants. Those servants protect capitalism from its own crashes and from its highly unequal and very unpopular policy responses. They often choose nationalism because it serves them well. There is nothing new in that. The left needs to respond in three key ways. First, it should stress how World War and Holocaust resulted in the last post-crash capitalism used nationalism for scapegoating. Second, it should expose scapegoat politics as aimed to deflect working class anger from a crash-prone capitalism. Immigration, trade policies, or European immigration define capitalism's preferred terrain of debate, not a critical left. The left's core response to capitalist nationalism should be this: capitalism is the problem, and to transition to a new, different, and fundamentally democratic system is the answer. That answer focuses on the democratization of enterprises, reforms of capitalism, welfare systems, new deals, social democracies, etc., however valuable and hard fought, are never secure. While production is organized capitalistically, a small minority then owns and operates enterprises, public and or private, reaps the profits, and rules each enterprise's majority, its employees. It then uses the profits and that power to undo whatever reforms the working class has won. The de facto monarchy/oligarchy inside capitalist enterprises contradicts democracy today as utterly as monarchy and oligarchy outside enterprises did historically. Because reforms of kingdoms rarely endure, modern society eventually abolished monarchies. Reforms of capitalist and private enterprises likewise rarely endure. What we need are worker co-ops to democratize enterprises by displacing their capitalists. Capitalism's political servants, past and present, reformists and neoliberals, private boards of directors, and public state managers reproduced that system after the 2008 crash. Bailouts, austerity, and widening inequality, capitalism and its public servants are now especially vulnerable. System change is this historical moment's opportunity. It should be a political project. The stimulus package. Too little, too late. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, CARES Act, is, for me, a spectacular disappointment. It's too little, too late. It does not recognize the systemic roots of this problem. It's going to throw more money, a lot more money, at the economy, not learning that this did not solve our problem back in 2008-09. Doing the same thing now, while cutting interest rates to next to nothing, risks leading this economic system to go on a binge of borrowing that the world has never seen before. For the last decade, we've been on the life support of a debt-ridden system on a scale no professional economist could have ever imagined. What we are doing now is again the same thing: free money, every business come borrow, get yourself through this disaster. Economically, we are not changing anything fundamental. We're not learning the lessons of the obvious failure to plan properly to handle a viral epidemic, even though we'd had a dozen of them in the last century, some of which were very deadly. I say society, to be honest, sticking its head in the sand, for fear of recognizing that this society needs fundamental economic changes, and it has for a long time. We're about to go through yet another crisis, not having learned a lesson, repeating the mistakes of the past, which will set up the next crisis. It's very disheartening. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and end it there for hopefully at least the first quarter of Chapter 2. This one is much longer than Chapter 1. I'm sure you guys have read a lot of books where one chapter is like 80 pages long, the other chapter is 5. So, but yeah, no other than I hope you guys enjoy it so far. I do like reading Dr. Wolf's work. Very critical capitalism also explaining maybe some of the benefits that come with it. And I do like the way it's structured, where he takes this is, for those who don't know, this book is just a compilation of his lectures from roughly February, March 2020 to now, so you guys can get the chance to see how everything built up. For those who maybe don't pay attention to the news or don't do a lot of research, or maybe, you could be elected to office and watch this and still don't know it. So I figured this is a great way to kind of share some information with everybody and kind of just read some stuff that I think is vitally important to know about economics and government, but also that kind of help shape the political future. But other than that, I hope you guys, again, hope you guys enjoyed and are willing, or maybe consider buying the book when we're done. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.